and welcome everybody to a new board year. Hopefully, some of you have been able to rest a little bit over the last couple of months. Myself, Dr. Saad, and Karen Riddell will be doing a presentation highlighting parts of my written submission, my board submission for those new board members and even new executive members. Historically, up until COVID started, I took our strategic plan and our strategic directions, and I tried to highlight various items we are working on within the organization under each of the headings to show how we're working towards achieving our strategic directions. And unfortunately, for the last couple of years, I have been unable to do that just because of timing and also, unfortunately, the relevancy. Usually we are preparing for the last 2 years for the board meeting the day of and basically hours before, because things were changing so quickly on us. Things have started to stabilize a bit. And as a result, I'm trying to go back to that format, and we'll see how long that lasts. So out of that format, though, I am going to highlight certain segments of it. And that's what I'm going to take you through now. Along with Dr. Saad and Karen Riddell. So the first thing I want to highlight is Bill 7. There's been a lot of discussion across the province with respect to this bill. It's called the More Beds, Better Care Act. And what that bill is the basis of it is the concept of alternative level of care patients. So what does that mean when you hear alternative level of care? In an acute care setting, it's a designation made by the physician caring for that patient, that they are no longer needing acute care, but they are needing some type of other type of care, short of going straight home with even no home care support. So there could be alternative level of care, is the acronym is ALC. It can be for long-term care. It can be for going home with home care. It can be going to a subacute facility. So when you hear the word ALC, it fits under those types of designations. A certain portion of those patients is what this legislation applies to, and that is ALCs for long-term care. Meaning a physician has designated that the patient no longer requires acute care, and as a result is the best place for that patient is in a long-term care facility. And once they're designated, then the work begins, but technically it actually, as you get close to that designation, the work is starting to get the patient and their caregivers ready for the placement in a long-term care facility. Up to this point, and still, the way in which patients are placed in a long-term care facility is based upon them making a decision, along with their family members or POA, power of attorney, on their choices. Before, I remember when I started in healthcare, it used to be your top 3 choices. Now it's gone to top 5. And you rank them with respect to availability, and then a determination is made about if they have space, what type of space that might be while you're waiting. Over the years, it's been a complicated process. It's very legislated, meaning individuals are placed on a waiting list. And you can't, short of some, and I won't get too deep into it, a crisis designation, you can't trump anyone on that waiting list, meaning you're on the waiting list and you're ranked in that priority, and your eligibility to get into that home continues as the ranking stays, unless someone passes away or is placed inside of a home, then you move up in your ranking as a result. Ontario, from my understanding, is one of the few jurisdictions that adheres to this and doesn't place a patient in an existing vacant long-term care bed while awaiting for their preferred choice. Is Ontario has allowed patients to stay in acute care and wait for their preferred choice. And I'll, get into the numbers a couple slides later with respect to what that looks like. So I have in front of you a couple quotes regarding this legislation. And the first one is from Minister Paul Calandra, who is trying to explain why now Ontario has decided to move towards this legislation. Like I stated, many jurisdictions across Canada already have it. And basically, to summarize what he's saying is, even though they have added over 3,000 acute care beds to the system over the last 2.5 years through funding, the projections are based upon the upcoming respiratory season that Dr. Saad's going to talk about. We're going to be about 2,400 acute care beds short, meaning we're going to have 2,400 more patients in Ontario than beds in and around January of 2023. That, needless to say, is a problem. At the same time, the OHA, their data suggests that indicates that there's close to 6,000 of these ALC patients, alternative level of care patients in hospital, as of the middle of last month. As I stated, some of them are ALC for home care, some of them are ALC for complex or subacute. They estimate 2,400 of them, 40% of them, are waiting for a long-term care bed. So if you look at our numbers, as stated, since January of this year, 1st until the end of July, our physicians have declared approximately 276 patients as alternative level of care, not requiring acute care, and qualifying them to be placed in long-term care. These ALC patients for long-term care have stayed a combined 5,300 days, 5,312 days in acute care after designation for long-term care. This is not their whole stay. So when you do the math on that, that equates on any given day to approximately 25 patient beds a day being occupied at Windsor Regional Hospital by ALC patients for long-term care, even though there are some long-term care beds available in the community. So that's 25 beds that are unavailable. At the same time, during the month of August, Windsor Regional Hospital had approximately 22 patients a day waiting in the emergency department for an inpatient bed to become available. So if you look at it as a domino game, I guess you would call it. It's not a game, it's real life here, is you have the ALC patients waiting for long-term care, approximately 25. Then we have 22 patients a day in the emergency department who have been admitted to an acute care bed, waiting to get a bed, but can't get it because there are no beds available for them. That cascades down, if you want, to even the waiting room, because the individuals in the waiting room are trying to get into the emergency department, but can't because these stretchers are occupied by patients already. So the ED staff does the best they can with the space they have to try to facilitate getting patients into the hospital emergency department proper. So it creates a problem. I can tell you these numbers for Windsor Regional Hospital, if you want to look at it, are probably some of the best in the province, meaning the work that we've done here with home and community care and other partners over the last few years has been extraordinary to have this number of 25 being as low as possible. There's others across the province of our size that are into the hundreds on a given day, that they have 100 of ALC patients waiting for long-term care. So I have to give credit to our team to making that number as low as it is, but you can tell it still creates a problem for us. So as stated, also simultaneously is across the province, across Canada, internationally, is as I don't want to use the words post-COVID, but as we move towards a more stable part of the pandemic, the number of patients being admitted from the emergency department to a hospital acute care bed has increased. So between I took January to June of 2019 and compared it to January to June of 2022. So the same time period, one being quote pre-COVID, one being now. And we are admitting from the emergency department 5 more patients a day. So instead of 44 a day, we have now 49 a day between the 2 campuses. And not only are we admitting more, but their lengths of stay are longer. So they're staying, instead of 6 days on average, they're staying 7.1 days in 2022. So when you compare 2022 to 2019, again, that's some 6,478 more patient days now during the first 6 months of this year as compared to 2019. When you look at that, that means we have pressure of 35 more acute care beds now being needed as compared to 2019. So you take that plus the ALC issue, and you can see where the problem is happening. So if you want to take a snapshot of what we're dealing with right now, like pretty much the last hour, is we have 33 ALC patients designated for long-term care. The 33 of them have waited a combined 973 days in this hospital in acute care since that designation. You do the math, that's close to 3 years of combined stay in the hospital just as ALC for long-term care. At the same time, and we've said this multiple times, is we're operating close to 60 more acute care beds now than we were pre-COVID. And still 18 of those are unfunded, and we're working with the government to get those funded. So what is Bill 7? There's been a ton of discussion regarding it. As stated, this legislation, I can tell you, has been asked for. I've been in healthcare over 20 years. I recall talking about this when I first started, the need for this type of legislation, these types of policies. This is not new. This has been discussed for years and decades. But as I stated, other jurisdictions have put it into place, other provinces. Ontario hasn't for multiple reasons. We don't have time to keep pushing this along, as stated by Minister Calandra. You know, people want to use the word right now, you know, we're in a crisis. I think right now we're not in a crisis. Are we going to be come December or January if we don't do stuff now to get ourselves in a better position? Yes, we will be for sure. So we have to make changes. And again, this is something that's been talked about for years or decades under every single different type of government. And it's being put into place. Again, it's allow for better patient flow. It's a clinical decision that a patient is declared ALC for long-term care. They are going to be able to wait when they go to the long-term care home that is available. They can wait there, and they're still in that priority system for their preferred choice. Meaning if they were 5th on the list, they're still 5th on the list, even if they're in a long-term care home. It doesn't prejudice their wait list priority by moving from acute care to a long-term care home. The way I look at it too is, hopefully, there has to be an appreciation that the long-term care residents or patients recognize that by doing this gets back to the flow issue. If they ever needed acute care again, that ability or that availability is going to be greater. Meaning if they come to the hospital, the chance or the numbers of those waiting for an acute care bed in the emergency department, where I outlined before, will be minimized, and they can get to that acute care bed quicker as a result of this. So they will personally benefit as well if they ever have to reattend acute care. And how do we get into this issue? This has been going on for years. There has been funding freezes for decades that have predated and is borne by every single political party. So this is not the current political party's issue, other than they have to be the ones here to try to correct it. And as stated, the current government at least has invested more than 3,000 beds, funding to over 3,000 beds. But this problem and the previous premier from the previous government, when she left government and was asked about her role, and some regret she had, and it was her statements during COVID, is she regretted the hard line they took on healthcare funding when she was in office, when her party was in office, and how that has prejudiced the current situation now. So there's plenty, if you want to, plenty of blame to go around. But unfortunately, like I stated, this should have been done years ago, and it hasn't, and it wasn't. And it needs to be done. Now, what we have to make sure happens is clearly this issue of movement of patients to a long-term care facility outside of their region. That is like the last, I put 3 last there. It's probably 10 last, meaning last resort. The chances of that happening are like slim to none. That, you want to talk about crisis, that is like crisis mode for that to happen. So unfortunately, that's what we hear about, because, you know, the quote legislation arguably as it's written now allows that to happen. Stated at the bottom here is they're working on regulations and some rules to come out. I assume, and I'm almost positive, that when those rules and regulations come out, that's going to be like a last resort for that to happen. If someone is moving into a long-term care home that is not their choice, it's going to be within that region. Some other things, these are my thoughts, is the costs associated with being in the long-term care, not their choice, should be something that should be heavily compensated, in the sense of their costs are nowhere near what they would be if they were in the home of their choice. It should be reduced. Also, our CFO helped me with some of these. The transport costs, these are some, you know, getting in the weeds, but when the transport costs to preferred long-term care home is addressed, meaning the family doesn't pay twice. So if they move into the home not their choice and they have to move again to the home of their choice, they don't have to pay twice for 2 moves, because technically they would have gone into the home of their choice and would have had 1 cost. And then the other thing we have taken into consideration is if their home of choice is like 2 days away, within the week away, you're going to try to avoid multiple moves, is meaning you don't move them to a home not of their choice and then move them knowing that within a week it's going to open up, is you try to move them once. So I would imagine that will be in the rules and regulations to minimize the moves. But I can tell you some of these waiting lists are months and years to get into the home of their choice. Generally, they're not days or weeks. And as a result, that's what adds to that number that I outlined before. So again, is this also the magic wand, or we do this, everything's solved, and October, November, December, January, February board meetings, we talk about this and everything is peachy? No, there are multiple issues that need to be addressed. This is just one of them. But if we don't do this one, then yes, we're going to be in a crisis come January. We are going to be in a full-blown one, guaranteed. That's, again, not to say this will, quote, avoid the crisis, but it'll greatly minimize what we're about to face coming into our fall and winter season. So again, this is something that should have been put into place quite some time ago and was not. And when I say quite some time ago, I'm not saying in the last 4 years. Would have been great if we did it, but we're occupied on something else in the last 3 years. But definitely before, there's no reason why this should have not been put into place. And unfortunately, now's the time, and we have to do it and fully support it being done. And as stated, I can tell you there are multiple hospital healthcare leaders that have been discussing this in Ontario for decades, and the need for this. And again, we're going to do our best to make it as smooth as possible for our residents and patients, but at the same time, focusing on those who are waiting for a bed or in the emergency department who need a bed. We just can't focus on one without focusing on the whole. And that's what we're doing as well.